Hello, and welcome to the Brothers' War. This is episode 1 of the Casus Belli series, illustrating events leading up to the war. Today, we set the stage primarily for the federal government in 1820. Now, in 1820, American politics is not quite a two-party system, but more of a Punnett square, composing of a north to south axis and a Whig to Democrat axis. The goal of the game in the legislature is to build a majority coalition and pass legislature in accordance with your platform. The Northern Whigs and the Southern Democrats will never agree on any one piece of legislation, so the goal for each is to flank the other by either building a North-South interparty coalition and winning over the remaining quadrant, or a Whig-Democrat geographical alliance and win over the last quadrant. This system was incredibly prone to deadlock, as we will see. The Democrats are small f federalists, and they believe that it is the individual states, the smaller polities that compose the Union, should have more of a say in the division of power in the country. The Whigs are centralists and believe that the federal government, the Union, should have more power. This four-way dance of the main parties will be accompanied by two third parties. First is the American Party, more commonly called the Know-Nothings, who are, for lack of a better term, progressive proto-fascists. Their platform includes anti-Catholicism, xenophobia, and populism from the far right, but they will also take labor rights, women's suffrage, and progressive economic policies from the far left, so they will sit directly in the center. They will never compose a large enough voting bloc to sway any particular votes in the legislature, however. Not so much a party as a secret society, they feature robes, passwords, initiations, and rituals. The name Know Nothing comes from the fact that when asked about all these robes, passwords, initiations, and rituals, they would demonstrate another facet of their activities, the vow of secrecy, and proclaim that they knew nothing about what you were talking about. Not so much a political party as a secret fraternity that occasionally runs for office. The second third party is the Free Soilers, which are a single-issue anti-slavery party that will be the furthest left at this time. There's really only one debate going on from 1776 to 1865 in national U.S. politics, and it's slavery. To what extent should it take? Should there be any curtailment? Should there be any restriction? What regulations should there be? And in the underground, whispered in secret corners of churches and illicit newspapers, the abolition of slavery. However, the debate almost never went on as one side for slavery, one side against slavery, because of a very tragic fact of American history. The vast majority of individuals, both in their political and private lives, are okay with the existence of the institution of slavery. Now, this is something I feel has been lost from mainstream historiography, that the majority of politicians and private citizens did not raise serious objections to slavery, and the objections that were raised were based on its implementation or worries about its spread, not that the institution was inherently wrong and that these people needed freedom. Abolitionists were few, incredibly few, and universally derided as unhinged radicals. At no point in American history did they exert significant influence, and I am including the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment in this. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. It's time to look at what actually is in the mainstream. Although I just explained the four-way dance of federal politics, in 1820, some labels are different. The Whigs aren't around yet. They're still the Federalists, but they are more or less interchangeable. The Democrats in this period are called the Democratic Republicans, but likewise have the same platform. The issue at hand is to settle the question of slavery in the Louisiana Purchase, which has now been fully surveyed and mapped after 17 years of very hard work and a slight diversion by the War of 1812. A certain region in the Middle East of the Louisiana Purchase has been rapidly settled and formed into slave plantations, primarily growing food and hemp, and have reached a population substantial enough to apply for statehood, calling itself Missouri. The legislative status quo for slavery at the time was determined by the Northwest Ordinance, prohibiting slavery in territories to the north of the Ohio River, which just so happened to leave out the majority of the Louisiana Purchase. Also, to keep the balance of slave and free states, they were always admitted in pairs, 2 at a time so that the Senate would stay balanced. Indiana and Mississippi in 16 and 17 respectively, Alabama and Illinois in 18. The bill for Missouri statehood was presented in the House of Representatives February 13, 1819, and tame exchanges for and against adding amendments went on without incident. It was pretty much universally accepted that it would be a slave state. When it was French territory, slavery was legal there, and it was settled by slave owners. But as the debate went on, James Talmadge Jr., Northern Democratic Republican, introduced the following amendment, which has been historically dubbed the Talmadge Amendment. It read, provided that the further introduction of slavery or involuntary servitude be prohibited, except for the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been fully convicted, and that all children born within the said state after the admission thereof into the Union shall be free at the age of 25 years. Talmadge primarily did this for the attention, quite frankly. He was what we now call a freshman in the House. He cited a personal dislike for slavery as the cause for this, but in reality he was probably opposed to it being a slave state on the basis of the Three-Fifths Compromise. Now, the Three-Fifths Compromise states that when congressional districts are being organized and appointed to a state, you add up all the free people, and then on top of that, you add a number equal to 3/5 of the slave population. This added a substantial number of representatives in the House from slave states representing people who in actuality did not have any say in their personal lives, let alone their political lives. This was believed to give the South undue representation in the House. It blunted the fact that there were simply more free people in the North. It's also important to note that Talmadge does not oppose slavery because slavery is bad. He opposes slavery because it means there will be more Southern representatives in the House. Big difference. Talmadge claims that the Fed has the authority to legislate the end of slavery in Missouri, citing the Northwest Ordinance. Missouri was the same latitude as Indiana and Illinois, that is, north of the Ohio, and so then surely it would in fact be a free state. The effect in the House was explosive. The Southerners responded that the Constitution guaranteed the states sovereignty over their rights, and that included the right to property, which in their minds included the right to own slaves. Congress could not legislate that Missouri would not have slavery. The Northwest Ordinance was irrelevant anyways. It predated the Constitution. They also cited the 1803 treaty with France that stated that new territories created in the Louisiana Purchase would share the same rights as the other states, ergo the right to property, ergo the right to own slaves. The question of slaves' right to be free, you'll notice, is not even on the radar for either party. Talmadge and his coalition, and he does have a significant coalition of Northerners behind him, he is not alone, responds to this by quoting from Article 4 of the Constitution, which reads, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this Union a republican form of government." He then proceeds to conclude that slavery is incompatible with republicanism. That's small r republicanism, by the way. He claims that the founders believed slavery was unrepublican, and it inadvertently reopens the freshly closed can of worms that is, what did the founding fathers intend? A can of worms which haunts the United States on nearly every issue to this day. He cites Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming the foundational concept of liberalism, that all men are created equal. He also quotes some notebooks of Jefferson where he says slavery causes the most boisterous passions and leads white men to exercise unremitting despotism over slaves. The primary argument here is based on constitutional interpretation and founders' intentions. In addition, a small, rhetorical, ethical argument was made by Northern Democratic Republican Arthur Livermore, pointing out the human suffering and cost and sheer loss inherent to slavery, declaring bold-faced in front of not a few slave owners that the sympathies of nature in slaves are disregarded, mothers and children are sold and separated, the children wring their little hands and expire in agonies of grief, while the bereft mothers commit suicide in despair. To which the Southerners responded with some waffling to the tune of, "Oh yes, slavery is bad, it's very bad, we harbor no illusions about that. However, it is a necessary evil, rooted into the foundations of the South's culture and economy. To end it suddenly would induce such a great mass of privations and issues, it would have to be eliminated gradually. We don't want what's happening in Saint-Domingue to happen here, do we?" Here making veiled references, if not threats, to the violent self-liberation of the slaves that happened recently in what is now Haiti. In addition, responding to Livermore's very tentative comments about the immorality of slavery, we see some of the ugliest words ever uttered in American history. Nathaniel Macon Southern Democratic Republican claims, "What ought surely to be inferred from Mr. Jefferson's notes in life is that he thinks slavery is a curse, but thinks it a greater curse to emancipate in his native Virginia. His democracy, like that of his great countrymen who have been before mentioned, appears to be of the white family." Therefore, white supremacy being the foundation of the American Republic, there is no way slavery could be unrepublican. William Lofton Smith, Federalist from South Carolina, then went on to great lengths pontificating the morality and value of slavery, refuted Jefferson's quotation, stating that, in his experience as a slave owner, slavery did not lead to boisterous passions at all, far less unremitting despotism, but said that the relationship he had with his slaves was patriarchal and mutually beneficial. He quoted the New Testament and said in his speech, Christ himself gave his sanction to slavery. He admonished them to be obedient to their masters. Christ came to fulfill the law, not to destroy it. Within these debates on the Talmadge Amendment, we see an ugly beast beginning to wake from its War of 1812-induced dormancy. The name of this beast is disunion, old-timey word for secession. It was thought by many congressmen, and they were all men, that this impertinent amendment would scratch a spark that would light a flame that would burn down the Union. Identifying this amendment as Northern aggression, many Southerners painted a picture of civil war, of bayonets and grape shot, of state turning against state. They said that the Talmadge Amendment reflected not a desire for opposition to slavery, but a manifestation of political rivalry. An assessment, to the Northerners' detriment, that was not untrue. This talk, however, was not done to actually enact disunion, but as a rhetorical tool to be wielded against the Northerners to tarnish them and to galvanize more Southerners. And although it really did seem to many newspapers and commentators that disunion was imminent, we know with hindsight that this is about 40 years too early. In 1820, talk of disunion was pure hype and grandstanding. Debate of the Talmadge Amendment would be far more influential to debates about secession than the actual secession. Furthermore, Southerners accused the Northerners of desiring to cause what was then called a servile war. Put into modern parlance, we'd probably call it a slave revolution or rebellion. Conjuring images of the violence and destruction of property in Saint-Domingue, they echoed the concerns of Thomas Jefferson, who was afraid that emancipation in the USA would look like, in his words, the bloody process of Saint-Domingue. Talmadge responded that this very talk led the pro-slavery coalition into a double bind. Since the whole gradual emancipation idea was based on the idea that slavery was an unstable, potentially dangerous institution, that we were on the verge of a slave revolution, how could slavery possibly be a positive, moral, good, Christian, Republican institution? Conjuring his own images of revolution, Livermore gave another speech, saying, "Can we, sir, by mingling bond with free, black spirits with white, like Shakespeare's witches in Macbeth, form a more perfect union and ensure domestic tranquility?" The answer to this was, of course, no. The mere presence of slaves was preventing the country from attaining these. This early connection of states' rights, slavery, and civil war was very portentous. Talmadge's coalition was eventually able to form a majority, passed the Missouri Bill, Talmadge Amendment inclusive, and sent it to the Senate, and the strongly Southern Senate completely rejected it. However, quite a lot of time has passed now, and Missouri really does need to be let into the Union, slave or free. So enter Henry Clay, Democratic-Republican senator from Kentucky, who proposes a compromise by drawing a line at 36 degrees 30 minutes north as the line dividing slavery within the Louisiana Purchase. With the exception of Missouri itself, all land north of the line would be free, everything south of the line would be slave. This bill was sent back to the House, and after some bicameral negotiations, it was passed in the House. President Monroe signed the Missouri Bill, and the slave state of Missouri and the compromise line were actualized on March 6, 1820. Congress had been deadlocked on the issue for over a year, and another state, Maine, had already been admitted to the Union while this debate was going on. The balance in the Senate was maintained. The compromise was controversial in public opinion, both in the North and South. But the compromise in the legislature would be held as sacrosanct for 30 years. But the beast of disunion had now been wakened, even if nobody knew or understood its implications yet. But while visions of the future were unclear, one man's vision of the future had now been dashed, the vision of Thomas Jefferson, who is still alive, by the way, and has been alive throughout these entire debates, has been dashed. To quote historian Peter Onuf by way of Elizabeth Varron, Jefferson interpreted the drawing of a line of separation between slave states and free ones as an ominous repudiation of his own cherished vision of America's future, an empire of states spreading across the continent, bound by shared interests, secure in their equality with one another, and free, unlike the colonies of the British Empire, from an overweening metropolitan power. The Missouri Compromise line, he feared, would make Americans foreigners to each other and embolden Northern Neo-Federalists to impose a second-class citizenship on the South. In Jefferson's view, all the blame for this nightmarish scenario lay on the northern side of the line. His hatred of Northern critics of slavery was now all-consuming. The virulence of his hatred reveals how deeply complicit Jefferson was in betraying his own vision of a union sustained by love. Jefferson so feared for the Union precisely because he could not stop himself from imagining its destruction. Jeffersonian republicanism is now over. A new era, an era of compromise, of dual standards, had begun. We now also have two diametrically opposed partisan conspiracy theories. The Northern conspiracy theory, that of slave power, proposed that a secret league of slave owners was determined to spread slavery west as far as possible and then north into the currently free states. The corresponding Southern conspiracy, Northern aggression, claimed that the abolitionists, big Northern capitalists, and the Irish were all in bed together and aimed at the forceful abolition of slavery in the South by any means, including a bloody servile war. The impacts of these conspiracies would in time crack the foundation of the Union and lay a bed of tinder ready for a spark. But now, whether or not a state is free depends on whether or not it is north or south of a certain line in the sand. Missouri and Maine were admitted roughly simultaneously to maintain the balance in the new Senate, and the beast of disunion has been put back to sleep temporarily. But a new war will bring new lands, and the very same debate will arise once again. So join us next time, where we will add far more tinder to the pile, just ready for a spark to come along.